Well, good day, everybody. This is Chris with the Ancient Scholar. Hope this video finds you all doing well. In this particular video, I'm going to discuss kind of a mixture of personal opinion and the literature and try to combine them together to arrive at some sort of rational answer for me. I don't imagine everybody or even most people would necessarily agree with what I have to say. I think that's all right because it's important to have a larger discussion around so-called heroic measures to prolong life. And I think sometimes we often get a little too ensconced in talking about procedures and skills without really appreciating what the longer term ramifications of said procedures and skills happen to be. So I want to talk about kind of a real popular flavor of the month kind of paradigm. It's been around for quite some time. It has just gained popularity, and that is something called ECMO, or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. And ECMO is a kind of modified heart-lung bypass paradigm, if you will. It is something that's been around, like I said, for a long time. It's been done to newborns for many decades. It goes back many decades. And like I said, it is a kind of a modified form of heart-lung bypass, and essentially what it is in people that have failing cardio and or respiratory systems. It is essentially a less invasive form of bypass where more peripheral, and I won't say peripheral in a literal sense, but large blood vessels that are a little more peripheral. They're still considered central vessels, but these larger blood vessels are accessed externally, and essentially what happens is blood is taken out of those large vessels. That blood goes through a machine that oxygenates the blood through a membrane and allows carbon dioxide to leave. And so essentially it acts as an external lung, and then there are pumps that pump the blood around, and in certain circumstances this can augment your circulatory system and can take over to some degree depending on the type of ECMO, can take over a significant amount of the cardiovascular workload. Again, depending on the type of ECMO, there are two major paradigms of ECMO. There's something called VV ECMO, and that's where you pull blood out of a large vein, you oxygenate it, and then you put it back into another vein. So it's veno-veno ECMO. And that kind of paradigm is maybe more, or not maybe, it is more common in people that have a robust heart. The heart is working, but there is some sort of respiratory failure going on. And then there is something called VA ECMO, where you pull blood from a large vein, oxygenate it, and pump it back into an artery. And VA ECMO, or veno-arterial ECMO, can actually support the cardiovascular system and can take over some or a lot of the workload of the heart if you have a failing cardiovascular system, mainly a heart. And so the specific paradigm of ECMO that's used kind of depends on the specific conditions, and I'm not really going to get into that here. What I want to do is I want to have a discussion about who should get ECMO, and maybe more importantly, would I personally want ECMO? And I think that's a good discussion because it's going to vary from person to person. And clearly the big question is, what's going on with me that I would require ECMO, first of all, and what's the overall prognosis for whatever that situation happens to be. And I'm kind of in an interesting phase of my life where I'm middle aged. I'm pushing toward 50, and so I'm in this. I won't say necessarily the twilight of my life, but certainly moving into autumn, if you will, to use the seasonal analogy. And my ability to recover and compensate to and from significant life-threatening illness and injury is compromised compared to who I was a couple decades ago, but is still probably more robust than who I may be in a couple of decades, assuming that I live. And so I'm kind of in this weird twilight zone where I don't have a robust physiology like a 20-year-old, but certainly not as frail as, say someone who's older than 70. And so, it's an interesting question. And I would say overall, those are the questions I would ask is, okay, why am I getting ECMO? And is this something that can be fairly easily or quickly corrected? Something like maybe some sort of cardiotoxic overdose where I would only need a limited amount of support. But then I have to ask myself, or I'd have to ask the question, how would I get myself into that kind of situation? I don't take any cardiotoxic drugs, beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, or, tricyclic antidepressants, anything like that. And so the chance that I'm going to find myself in that situation is pretty low. And so I kind of have to look at what would be the more likely problems, if you will, that would get me into a position where I would be looking at ECMO. And, these are not going to be very good things. Not that in general, anything that gets you on ECMO is not going to be good, but just in particular, the kinds of the more likely things that I would be looking at are going to be, pretty significant cardiovascular compromise. If I have a massive MI and I go into cardiogenic shock, I develop an infection that significantly compromises my cardiorespiratory system. And these things at my age, the likelihood of making a meaningful recovery has to be considered. And so when we look at the data for ECMO in general, it's interesting. The data is kind of all over the place, but there are definitely some trends. And when we look at just kind of like the overall prognosis of ECMO, there are a few studies. There's several studies out there, but you're looking at, on average, 5-year survival rates. So people that live 5 years after their brush with ECMO. If it's VA ECMO, you're looking at about 1 in 3, give or take, but that's a good number. 1 in 3 people are still alive after 5 years. Okay, that's VA ECMO. And then it's slightly higher, approaching about 4 in 10, or about 40%, a little less than 40%, when looking at VV ECMO. And that kind of makes sense because VA ECMO is a type of ECMO where you're providing cardiac support, and these are probably going to be more serious conditions that would require ECMO to be initiated in the first place. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. And, if people can survive, 30 days, the overall survival rates are a little bit higher. So of when we look at like 33% VA ECMO 5-year survival rate, a lot of the 60-some% that die will die within that first 30 days. And so if you can make it, past a month, the 5-year survival rates are, fairly higher, in the low 70s for both VA and VV ECMO. So right around, say, 70%. That is if you get past that first 30 days. But on average, you're looking at between a 1 in 3 to 4 in 10 overall survival rate. So that's just kind of broadly speaking. So that's kind of what you're looking at. So what does this mean? This is something that there's a lot of risk. There is a pretty high risk of mortality, and there is also a very high risk of morbidity, and that is maybe something that is a little underappreciated when talking about ECMO. And when we look at people who survive their brush with ECMO, um, the the quality of life following their brush with ECMO is is consistently very different. Um, and from the evidence that I've seen, very few people, particularly adults, when we're talking newborns, um, I'm going to be a little more flexible there with newborns and younger people, but in adult patients in general, the overall quality of life is, from what I can tell, and this is just my interpretation, obviously, as someone who's healthy or relatively healthy as far as I know, um, it looks like the overall quality of life is significantly lower following ECMO. Does that necessarily mean that those people don't deserve to live or have that option? No. But what I'm saying is that your quality, that you cannot expect to have the same kind of life following ECMO that you did pre-ECMO, assuming you actually survive, which is, I would say on average, it's more likely that you're not going to survive. And then if you do survive, you are going to experience a very different life following that, from neurological sequelae to high degrees of post-traumatic stress in some people. Again, the evidence is here and there, but it is pretty clear that a lot of people, even 6 months after they survive, are compromised in the sense that they do not have the kind of life prior to ECMO, and that's in general. Like, people that have critical illness or injury have to go to the ICU. In general, their quality of life, after surviving and recovering and getting discharged, the type of life that they have is generally going to be different in some way. And I know there are a lot of people that talk about like post-traumatic growth and things like that, and I don't want to deny that, but I think I also want to be realistic about what does life look like when we implement these heroic measures to try to prolong life. And again, I'm not anti-ECMO, but I do think it really is important to have a very realistic appreciation of ECMO beyond just the skill. And again, that's where I see a lot of the discussion around things like ECMO is more on the skill and making it happen quickly and this and that. And I think we also need to appreciate the kinds of sequelae that are going to happen. And I think we need to also be able to communicate that as effectively as possible to people who are looking at making these decisions, because often it's not going to be the patient making the decision. It's going to be their family, their power of attorney, their spouses, etc. And you need to be able to provide them as realistic an expectation as possible. You don't ever want to completely take away hope, but you need people to understand what it actually means to implement some of these heroic measures and kind of be able to articulate, hey, this is what we look at, overall, how people survive. And if they survive, there is a very high likelihood that they are not going to be the same person they were prior to this, that life is going to be different, and that can be in a variety of ways. do neurological and physical disabilities, ongoing chronic prolonged cardiovascular compromise, to cognitive and behavioral changes, et cetera, to psychological changes. And so, as I am approaching kind of transitioning through middle age, and I'm kind of looking at at the calculus, it's, I mean, obviously, I can't answer that because that question robustly, because I'm not in that situation, and I'm able to step back a little bit, and I'm looking at it less emotionally. But I would say overall, unless this was some sort of condition that had a reasonable, that can be reasonably reversed and treated, I'm not sure if ECMO would be something that I would really want, knowing what I know about kind of how I might end up. I mean, if this is something that was pretty easily maybe would only need a couple days of support, there's definitely an argument there. But if this is something that is ARDS and multi-system organ dysfunction and things like that, the likelihood of me making it through that, it would be low with or without ECMO. And then if I do, the likelihood that I would be substantially disabled and my life would substantially deviate from the way it is now would be so high. It's hard for me to think about would I want that kind of existence or not. But again, it's tough because I'm not in that situation, and perhaps on the other end of it, I would think, well, at least I'm alive. Right. I guess the whole point of this is to say that it's actually a lot more nuanced and complex, and it's going to come down to person, and being able to articulate, kind of really what you want out of life, and understanding that sometimes death isn't the worst thing that can happen. I know it seems kind of weird for me to say that, but I really do think that there are situations that are probably worse than death for at least some people, right? Some people will have a type of existence that they would definitively think is worse than just not existing. Whatever that means, I don't know what happens after death. I have some ideas, and I think it's, personally, this is just personally how I look at it. I think it's a lot like what would happen before being born. Whatever that kind of existence is more than likely, is, as far as I understand the universe. I certainly could be wrong, but my impression is that whatever death is, it's probably very similar to whatever state the concept of I really wouldn't exist, but whatever that state is prior to living. But that's maybe a different discussion. I think it's really important for us to have these frank and relevant discussions about a lot of these things. And for all of our cunning, humans we're not as awesome as we like to think we are. We're not as sophisticated, we're not as advanced, and I just see a lot of this kind of stuff about people talking about living longer and certain diets, and well, I can demethylate my DNA and prolong life. And at the end of the day, we're all gonna die, and we're nowhere near like all the science and technology and all these people that are out there talking about uploading your consciousness. We don't really, I mean, we don't even have a great definition for consciousness. there's so much more we don't know and we don't understand that, we're a lot of what we can do is still pretty basic and uninformed to some extent. Um, and I think we have to take a realistic view of what life is and what it means. And it's going to vary from person to person, but I just think we as providers, particularly if you are in someone like me, I'm not going to be making these high level decisions about putting people on ECMO or even having high level conversations. So, the onus isn't so much on me, but at least what I can do is put a video out and kind of discuss where my thoughts are and where some of my concerns are, and then just put my personal opinion, because at the end of the day, I think a lot of people appreciate providers who can personalize things and say, what would I want? How do I look at this personally, and how does this fit into my life, right? Versus, oh, this is just a cool skill that I can do. This is something that is technically demanding, and woo-wee, this is really cool stuff, which is certainly a legitimate way of looking at it. But at the end of the day, we also have to appreciate that there is a human being, there is a person, and then there's their greater social sphere. And, at the end of the day, how does that fit in, the life that they have before and possibly after? What does that look like more than likely? And is that a kind of existence that person would really want? And the older you get, the more medical problems you pick up along the way, the less able you are to compensate, and the more likely you are to have significant disability. I think that calculus continues to change throughout one's life. And so there are some dynamics there. If I was 20 years old and I was having this discussion, I would more than likely, in fact, I remember having discussions about, hey, talking about, well, I don't ever want to die. That's right. That's horrible. That's the worst thing I could think of, not existing. And then here I am going, well, I've lived, I've had a pretty reasonable life up to this point. Would I want to have a garbage existence? Would I want to lose my mental capacity and not be able to engage in the world and in ways that I find meaningful? Right? The calculus changes. So anyway, that's just what I wanted to talk about today. Maybe a bit of a somber thing, but it's just something I maybe don't see emphasized as much. And I just see it's all about the skills and doing this and, the conferences and learning how to do it. And it's like, well, yeah, there's that part of it for sure, but there are also a lot of other things that we need to think about. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out and see what you all thought. Hopefully you found this video somewhat illuminating or helpful. Take care, everyone. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.